Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
To close our conference, our final keynote address is from Dr. Benjamin Breen. Dr. Breen is an associate professor of history at the UC Santa Cruz. His second book, Tripping on Utopia, Margaret Mead, The Cold War, and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science, was published by Grand Central in 2024. And his first book, The Age of Intoxication, Origins of the Global Drug Trade, is a tour de force through the colonial history of the drug concept. This is not in my script. Highly recommend it. He was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University's Society of Fellows in the Humanities from 2015 to 2017, and he currently teaches on early modern Europe and the early modern world, the global history of science, technology, and medicine, and the history of drugs broadly construed. Please join me in welcoming Benjamin Breen. The last time I have to do that.
Can we give a round of applause for Paul and Jeff for organizing the conference? Also, I just want to say, this is one of my favorite conferences I've ever been to, and it's kind of stunning to think about the collective knowledge of everyone in this room and all the different ways it ramifies out into different fields and places. Forms of knowledge, like came up last panel, which was amazing. And I just want to, can we give a round of applause also for everyone who presented in the last 2 days? Really, really love that. And the ways that the different parts of the panels interacted was so delightful. It was so unusual in some cases and different from other conferences I've been to. And it sort of is what I want to talk about today, that multiplicity, the themes of diversity, multiplicity, pluralism, but specifically thinking about that in the context of my own field, history of science. Any history, like raise your hand if you are a historian of science. I'm just curious if there's any in the room, a little bit. How many people here would say that they are, at least by some definition, medical professionals or science professionals? Raise your hand. Okay, so maybe 50-50 or something like that. I am an historian of science partly because I am interested in what science does when it interacts with other things. And so my talk is mostly going to be about not so much psychedelic science as such, but the ways that it breaks down at the boundaries of other fields. And I think that hopefully will be helpful for thinking through collectively what the interfaces are between all the things we've been talking about. So I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for Q&A. And I just want to flag also, this is a new book project. It's actually, I've never done this before, but I was doing archival work for the past week. So there's stuff that I literally found in the Houghton Library yesterday that is in my talk today, which is why I was late with the PowerPoint slides. Sorry about that. But I wanted to leave room for some spontaneity. And so this is not a polished talk. I've never presented on some of this material, and it's a new book project that I am looking forward to talking through with you and just seeing how it interfaces with everyone else in the room. So I thought it would make sense to invoke William James, just like the great keynote yesterday did. There's William James Hall, as Noah Feldman mentioned, but there's also, even closer to here, I didn't realize just how close William James's house is, right around the corner, in earshot of us right now. You could yell at the top of this building and hear it from his house. It's one of those things about being in a place. It's so rewarding to see the spatial connections. And so I thought I would actually quote from William James, which seems apt, and it seems especially apt to quote from the highest day of his life. This is William James at his most intoxicated one day in 1882 when he took nitrous oxide, probably in his house over there. So I'm going to attempt a bit kind of a dramatic reading here. This is attached to a learned disquisition on Hegel, which he published in the journal Mind. But this is like a little note at the end. I'm curious, how many people have encountered this before? Okay, so you're in for a treat. I found this when I was 18 years old on arrowwood.org, and it's it changed my life. It's why I'm here today is arrowwood.org. Thank you, Arrowwood. What's mistake but a kind of take? What's nausea but a kind of awsia? Think about it. Sober, drunk, unk, astonishment, agreement, disagreement, emotion, motion, reconciliation of opposites, sober, drunk, all the same. Kind of like last panel, By George, nothing but O thing. It's all a big circle. That sounds like nonsense, but it's pure onsense. He's getting turned on. Thought deeper than speech. Medical school, divinity school. He's literally talking about this building. School, school, school. And then it ends with him invoking God. He literally published this and then said it helped him understand Hegel finally. I'm not joking. The funny thing is he actually, in a letter years later, says it helped him understand that he hated Hegel. So he gave up on Hegel thanks to this nitrous experience. So the stuff that I found in the archive this week has, I think, added a little bit to the knowledge of what's going on here. I always just understood it as like, oh, that's funny, William James got really high on nitrous once and wrote about Hegel. But I'm going to argue in the middle part of this talk that it's actually kind of foundational to not just the Jamesian realm of science, but actually to the formation of what we might call proto-psychedelic science, the kind of milieu, the thinkers like James who were emerging out of what Nicholas mentioned, like the sort of singularity tradition of the 19th century, and also, crucially, mixing together new anthropological insights, so emerging ethnobotanical research, and interfaces with Western and non-Western knowledge at its very earliest forms. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about today. So we're going to come back to that nitrous oxide moment of William James. But just to give a situation of like where I'm coming from, I'm an early modern historian of science and medicine, but I think of myself mostly as an historian of consciousness. I'm coming from UC Santa Cruz, which actually has a department called History of Consciousness, which I'm not a member of, but I feel like I should be an honorary member because it's what I do. And largely what I enjoy doing in terms of kind of troubling the concept of the history of drugs is looking at the ways that drugs operate in a culture and the way that they change a culture, and specifically putting them in tension in some kind of communication with the concept of cultural responses to technological change. And technology hasn't come up. It's come up a bit in this conference, but I'm going to try to talk about it more because psychedelics, in addition to being, perennial parts of human cultures and having all kinds of deep histories, are also kind of, in some cases, new, and in some cases technological. They can be many things. There's a pluralistic formation of psychedelics in the modern world that draws from many sources. So my second book moves to the 20th century, and now for this book, I'm trying to kind of find that earlier ground between the pre-modern world and the very modern 20th century by looking at what I think of as the machine age. I didn't coin the term, but I'm learning a lot from reading machine age thinkers who saw themselves in their own words as living in an age of machines. So what's interesting about this period is that unlike some things that we later retroactively apply as a period concept, they called it the machine age at the time. And they saw themselves as being transformed by technology. And I'm going to argue that there's something going on both with the history of science, but specifically the history of psychedelics and psychedelics' relation to culture and science that is formed out of this sort of juncture between humans and machines in this period. So what I want to start with is, I personally, what I've gotten most from my own psychedelic experiences is realizing the falsity of binaries. The human tendency to create binaries is natural, but psychedelics are very helpful for making you see how artificial some of those can be. So Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead's husband, said for him, his own psychedelic experience in the 50s saw him break down the barrier between the perceiver and the thing perceived. And so what's interesting about binaries is that even though I don't like them, they're very useful for doing academic work. It helps you structure material and it helps you think through things and make an argument. So what I'm going to do here is, as a kind of playing around with binaries, I'm going to start out by situating us with two very opposing streams in the history of science, and I think the history of psychedelics writ large in the present, which I'm going to call surveillance science or culture, and the subliminal science. So what do I mean by that? Surveillance science could be called Galtonian science. It's a science of control. It's based on quantification, data, and in particular, operationalizing or leveraging data as a way of improving society in the minds of the scientists. And usually in the minds of subsequent people, that's not improvement. It's usually something like some sort of Platonic philosopher king science that is trying to fix the world without actually really engaging with the world. It's rooted in biometric data, and it tends to think of humans as sentient automata. So this is an actual group of people in the late 19th century who both created the concept of eugenics and social Darwinism, but also played a kind of important role in developing the logic and the vocabulary of machine learning. Cybernetics owes a large debt to these people. And they're interwoven with the early history of psychedelics too, I will argue, because they invented the concept that science needs to draw from mass questionnaires, like just came up in the last panel. This idea that we generate scientific knowledge by going out into the public and yielding data from questionnaire responses, from measurement, double-blind studies. This is like foundational to all those concepts. At the same time, emerging alongside it in the 19th century is what I call subliminal science, the Jamesian approach, which kind of is like what Nicholas was talking about with idiopathic singularity-based science. But I'm going to actually, it's interesting tension with that category, because what I'm going to argue is that even though the Jamesian science was in some ways very strongly opposed to the sort of Galtonian or surveillance science that was emerging in the late 19th century as well, specifically around the question of empire. William James was very ardently anti-imperial around the time of the Spanish-American War. People like Francis Galton were the opposite. And then also in the metaphors we use, we might call surveillance science as something that's centered on the concept of life as a machine. The human mind is a machine that you can monitor, you can gather data from it, you can read it, right? You can brainwash it. William James and the Jamesian approach to science is much more about membranes, veils, liminal spaces. That's why I used to call it subliminal, because it means, limen is a Latin word for the threshold. So it's like the idea of threshold or boundary as the important operative principle. And in red, I have the ways that these two strands of science tend to attack one another, right? William James is often talking about scientism as a bad thing. His opponents on the other side are talking about quackery, or being a dupe, or being gullible, falling prey to spiritualist tricksters, and so forth. But I just said I don't like binaries, even though I do think it's helpful to think about these as two principles, or two tendencies or trends that are operational in the 19th century and today. Think like Palantir and Burning Man or something like that. They're kind of the same thing in some cases. They entangle, right? So they're both Darwinian, they're both post-Darwin, they're both largely Western, and they're both rooted in big data. So I mentioned that questionnaire-based biometric sort of regime of knowledge that emerges in the late 19th century. It's literally why computers are invented, is to kind of figure out how do we handle this level of data. The first computers are women who are sitting in a room crunching numbers, and then they get replaced by machines. But first came the data. And that data was suffused throughout 19th century science, and it did not obey what your stance toward the Spanish-American War or eugenics or race was. It was entangled with all the same people. So the rest of my talk is going to be looking at two moments in the history of science and the history of psychedelics that I think are like helpful for thinking about that entanglement between these two types of knowledge, the subliminal and the surveilled. I'm trying to think through moments of boundary crossing where these kind of mix together, and also moments when scientists push up against what science is into the realm of the mystical, the religious, into non-Western ways of knowing. So Margaret Mead, William James, that's my third book. And then also just thinking about implications for today a little bit. So this is now more familiar material. This is what my book, Tripping on Utopia, sort of centered on. This document that I found in the Library of Congress that literally just called, it was in a folder, it just said LSD. So I just saw it in this finding aid. I was like, all right, I'll call for the LSD folder. And it's only 4 pages long, but it's a really, really rich document. Pretty fascinating. And this is a part of it I have never really explored before, is the elements of Margaret Mead's engagement with LSD that can be kind of thought of as in a continuum with the 19th century Jamesian tradition, but also a rupture with it. And also the ways that it represents an early moment when things like this conference, this kind of formation of different thinkers, was possible to start thinking about. What I mean by that is applying non-Western and non-scientific forms of knowledge about consciousness to a scientist thinking about consciousness. Margaret Mead, because she was a cultural anthropologist, was very well positioned to do that. She's also a very complex figure in a lot of ways. There's a lot to say about Margaret Mead, but I will spare you. I'm kind of sick of explaining and debating Margaret Mead, but she's a fascinating figure. Also, so too is her third husband, Gregory Bateson, who I'm not going to have time to talk much about, but I just wanted to flag that he was also involved in psychedelic research in the 50s and has quite interesting things to say on the topic. Is a little bit ambivalent about it. So I was thinking today, what would William James think about this conference? He would love it, obviously. He'd be so flattered, probably. Although he wouldn't like that last comment about him being what was that, a disgusting man? Margaret Mead would have been super into it, and Gregory Bateson would have been off in the corner, kind of muttering to himself. I don't think he would have been liking the positivity. He didn't really like psychedelics that much, even though he tried them. So Margaret Mead's famous for Samoa, but in fact, she wrote a book that almost no one read that was early ethnographic research into the peyote among the Omaha people. And she actually has field notes that are quite extensive, where she's interviewing at least a dozen people about the role of this substance in their lives, both as a sacrament, but also as just a cause of social change. So I read her field notes, and there's one woman who says, I used to use it, but it's making people's lives fall apart. I think of it as like alcohol now. Another person says what you would expect. It puts me in tune with my ancestors. And yet another person says it gives me a headache. So Margaret Mead is really interesting because she's just writing this all down, and she's not really trying to take an opinion about it. She puts it in her book. It's not a central part of this book from 1930, the one on the left, but it is in there. And so she's not the first person to do this. In fact, other Franz Boas students at Columbia were doing this. Alfred Kroeber was writing his dissertation in 1902. It's actually a really great resource if anyone's looking for early ethnographic work on the American Southwest that involved peyote, and he took it himself. What's interesting is that she returns to the theme of psychedelics and cultural change in this book, New Lives for Old. And so she was writing and finishing work on this book in the summer of 1954 when she gets embroiled in MK Ultra, actually. So her exposure to LSD was basically via her friend who was an MK Ultra consultant. So it's a different avenue for being exposed to the substance, but because she was an optimist, even though he's a incredibly creepy guy, she starts to see LSD as a potential source of a positive mobilization of people toward a kind of shared global culture, which would allow them to cope with rapid change. That's kind of how she starts to see it. So what's interesting about the memo is that it immediately kind of jumps out on a positive note. She talks about what she calls the truth drug aspect, and decides it's not a truth drug. So she's immediately like, okay, it's not used as a truth drug, so what is it? She also says it's a pathway away from mysticism and escape, which is kind of interesting because it's almost antithetical to the ways that I would have expected someone encountering these substances in the late 50s to see them as. They might see them as a pathway to mysticism and escape. So she, right off the bat, has this kind of contrarian take on psychedelics. She's also seeing them very much in the context of the Cold War. So this is what I mean about these entanglements, because you can clearly see the surveillance science part here. She's literally involved in this MKUltra study, probably unwittingly, but it's unclear how much she knew. The part that's really looped into the kind of 19th century romantic psychonaut concept is that she then decides to take it herself. She sees herself rightfully as someone with an extremely unusual mind. She was brilliant and quite unusual, a strange person. And she is curious what it's going to do to her own brain. So in this folder, there's this memo where she's taking field notes of watching other people taking LSD. And I'll talk a little bit more about what she was actually doing there. But then after that, the next page says, deciding I will take the drug. And then there's letters from her to Harold Abramson, the MKUltra guy, saying, I would like to be your guinea pig, effectively, is what she's saying. And she wants to do it in a public way. She wanted it to actually be a research project where it would be documented and she would actually be published. Margaret Mead takes LSD. What did it do to her brain? She thought it might make her more creative, right? She was seeing it kind of like in a smart drug context. She references extraordinary speed of communication being granted by LSD. So it's almost like she's seeing it I almost see this as like an early genealogical link to like the Silicon Valley approach to psychedelics. It's like It's like, she's gonna like get smarter, she's gonna get new ideas. And she also wants to do it in public. So in this case, I think of it as quite interesting as an example of someone who's involved in this sort of shadowy secret surveillance program. Mind-altering drugs are being used in this Cold War context, but also someone who wants to be a psychonaut, someone who wants to go there and to see what happens to them when they take this thing. So she would be a test subject herself. Interestingly, she actually had a chance to meet Aldous Huxley. They have a friend in common, but she reads Doors of Perception, which had just come out, and finds it boring. So this is one of those things I love about the archive is it's like, oh my God, like what if she just said, I love Doors of Perception, I met with Aldous Huxley, literally this whole history would have been completely different. But she decides not to meet with them. What she does do instead is she works with Harold Abramson effectively as a medical anthropologist. She's kind of there observing these studies, seeing what they do, seeing what the test subjects do, and talking to them. What's interesting here is that ultimately she does not take LSD, and I'll talk for a second after this about why she doesn't, but it actually strongly shapes her thought. She's having all these fertile dreams, as she puts it, and she pays a lot of attention to her dreams. And in fact, that book, New Lives for Old, has an appendix where she says she's studying the impact of technological change on the Manus island off the coast of New Guinea, which was completely transformed by World War II and also by colonization before that, Australian mining companies. And it's just a horrifying story that you can find thousands more examples of in the 20th century. She was in contact with the people here on that island in the 20s, and then came back to it in the 50s to see how that disruption and delocation of being exposed to modern technology had changed people. And she actually says, we are all like those people. The 20th century is going to do this to all of us. We're all being disrupted and deracinated and pushed outside of traditional ways of life that are, the products of thousands of years of people's trial and error, finding ways to live that are no longer tenable. And in that context, maybe we should all try taking LSD and mescaline. She actually says that at the end of this book, and no one pays attention to it. It's so weird to me. I think it's just because no one had heard those terms. I mean, like I said, Doors of Perception had just come out. So this is like at the same time, 5 years later, that would have been meaningful to people, but no one had really heard of these drugs at that point. So one of the things going on here is this mixing of an attempt to mix together things she's learning from this psychedelic study happening in the Upper East Side in the 1950s. Again, very technological, people in lab coats. It's funded by the CIA. There's nothing connected to non-Western science at all about this setting. But she's using this to think through her own fieldwork, which she has literally just returned to. She has spent 6 months in Manus in New Guinea and gets back to New York and starts doing this. So she's mingling the two together in a way that I think is very prescient and is very much like kind of a calling card of 21st century psychedelic culture and academic work. And I actually think there's an amazing book she could have written on this topic, but she didn't because of the Cold War. So why did she not take LSD? It's the same reason why she never published any of this LSD memo or any material from it. This, again, was MK Ultra. She was part of this secret program, and she kind of deduced that something weird was going on. Her actual job in this context was to apply personality tests. In fact, the one she's applying here, TAT tests, is developed by Henry Murray at Harvard. And Henry Murray, if people don't know, was a psychologist at Harvard who then worked in the OSS in World War II and applied TAT tests to aid in personality assessment of POWs, of OSS agents, and so forth. So it was very much part of the World War II psychological complex. And now in the 50s, she's applying it to understanding psychedelics. So she's doing TIT type interrogations, she calls it, on these test subjects. And she's giving Caligores, which is another personality test. The interesting thing is I actually tracked down this person that she's giving this TAT test to. When I spoke to her, she was still alive. So this is Veltman, graceful, dark little German Jewish girl, neurological secretary, studying to be an opera singer with an Italian who feels everything starts with soul, never mentions body. I spoke to her, and it turns out she's a distinguished opera singer and very happy, and she's doing great. And she actually was happy to speak to me. Her experience of this was that she had a good time. So she was a test subject, but she was also the secretary in this study. it didn't really affect her much at all. The main thing she said to me is that Margaret Mead stressed me out. Because she kept doing these personality assessment tests. And also, nod to psychical research from yesterday, she said she kept asking me if I had psychic powers, which is not in the memo, but I think this personality tests were partly trying to see if there was extraordinary speed of communication. So if there's some kind of supernormal abilities unlocked by this. Mead actually was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, so it does check out. What's interesting here is that she's, again, connecting the experience of the people of Manus, this island off the coast of New Guinea, to the experience of someone who had fled Nazi Germany. So this woman was not in the Holocaust, but her family fled in the 30s. They were German Jews who ended up relocating to New York City. And Margaret Mead asked her about that. She asked her what it was like to be part of a dead and gone culture. She says she was brought up rigid German. Her parents now know better. Look what happened. Can you imagine tripping on LSD and then Margaret Mead starts asking you about your experiences as a Jew in 1930s Germany? But that's actually what happened here. So Margaret Mead is, again, pulling out this material from this very modern post-World War II conjunction of things, a very Cold War context, and then relating it back to her ethnographic fieldwork to make a recipe for common human survival in the 20th and 21st centuries, which is what her book was about. So in that sense, I think, sorry, repeating slide here. In that sense, I found Margaret Mead to be very like a kind of a trailblazer and a pioneer of the type of work that has been done in the last couple of days. Cross-disciplinary, open-minded, but she's also doing personality assessment tests in the service of the US government. So it's very much the surveillance science part as well. What ends up happening is she decides not to be a test subject for LSD because she herself was being surveilled. If you read her FBI file alongside this memo, literally, J. Edgar Hoover is writing memos to FBI agents who are tracking Margaret Mead. I'm not exaggerating. At this exact moment, they are tapping her phone and interviewing her neighbors, trying to figure out whether she was a communist. And also, she's about to move in with her lover, Rhoda Matro. So she lives with Rhoda Matro for the rest of her life. Two women who are about to move in and share an apartment, who are in a sexual relationship. And all her neighbors are being questioned about whatever happened with her third husband. Why does he not live with her? Why did they get divorced? Do you know anything about her personal life, right? They literally interviewed her gymnastics teacher when she was an undergrad at Columbia, you know? So they were going very deep into extreme forms of McCarthy-era Cold War surveillance at the exact moment when she's considering whether she wants to take LSD. At the bottom of this file, the last part of the file, is this article which claims that LSD kind of is a truth drug. It's a psychotomimetic, and it gets you to say things from your subconscious that you want to conceal. And she ends up telling her friend, you know, I read that article, Step into the World of the Insane, and I decided I probably am not gonna take LSD. It's probably not a good idea, and it probably wasn't. So I feel like she herself embodied this entanglement between the subliminal science and surveillance science, the sense of trying to cross boundaries, trying to be creative, trying to put yourself not just as the observer, but as the person who is being perceived, crossing the patient, the doctor-patient boundary. And then a final kind of dark note. The very first line of this memo says, Abramson interested. He had asked me how to get candidates for experimentation from low-income groups the year before. I suggested Father Divine's Angels. And Father Divine's Angels turns out to be a sort of corrupt charity run in Harlem. So this is basically African-American children who she suggested as candidates for experimentation. So the memo is a really mixed bag. It's filled with all these completely paradoxical elements. And that paradox is kind of what I was trying to figure out by going back one step. Like I think of Margaret Mead as, like Aldous Huxley, like some of the people who have come up before in this conference, one of these inflection points just before the famous story in the 60s, but sort of laying a groundwork for it. But what happens if you go back to the groundwork that was laid for that? So William James on nitrous. William James is a psychologist. If you haven't heard of him, Varieties of Religious Experience is unbelievable. But his earlier work is what I'm going to be talking about now. He's actually kind of quite a different personality type when he's in his 30s and 40s than the William James we know and love, who's a sort of revered multidisciplinary scholar of mystical experience and psychology. In his 30s, he was a really depressed guy who lived with his parents, actually, and he was not doing well. So this book is amazing if you want to know more about the depression and the weird lives of the various James family members. It's a group biography, but just to give you an idea, this is a drawing that William James made. And he made a number of drawings that sort of demonstrate and document a really severe set of neurasthenic symptoms. He called it neurasthenia, and I'm going to use that term because that was like the category used at the time. Certainly, we might diagnose him with clinical depression today. And his sister suffered from very severe neurasthenia that is, I don't know, I'm not going to hazard a diagnosis, but it was completely debilitating. She basically never left her room, and it ruined her life. And it actually kind of ruined her family's lives. Their whole family story is strongly shaped by Alice James's experience of neurasthenia. Henry James, the famous novelist, also suffered from what William called spinal troubles, but in fact, as I'll talk about, that means spinal neurasthenia. So it's a group of, it's like this, all of the siblings really are grappling with fairly severe problems, challenging mental states that they consider to be debilitating at various times of their life. And you can kind of see this here. This is a drawing William James made of his family, all being more or less failures, especially the two outside ones. So actually, it's kind of funny because Henry James is like the golden boy there in the middle, where it's like everyone's kind of celebrating him. He had already become a famous writer, or was about to be at this time. William was like the loser of the family, and along with his sister, that's how he saw himself. And he kept seeing himself that way. He might have, in fact, agreed with the disgusting William James. He would be like, yeah, I am disgusting. That was kind of his personality. So why did he take nitrous? Partly as a sort of self-cure. He was always into various cures for what ailed him, and he was a seeker. He was trying to find the tools, not just for his patients, because he was a medical doctor as well, but for himself, his own mind. He considered to be sick. To the day he died. I mean, I was reading through his letters, and he's getting neurasthenia when he's 60 years old too. He has to go to take time off from teaching because he had another neurasthenic breakdown. It keeps happening. It's just not, he doesn't really parade it in his books. Why does he try nitrous? Well, nitrous has been around for a while. It's not an ancient drug, but it's also, by the time of the 1870s and 80s, something that your grandparents could have used. Humphrey Davy, I'm not going to spend more time on him, but he basically creates the technology of hotboxing nitrous. He fills a room up with nitrous and invites his friends, who included like romantic poets like Coleridge and Southey, to walk into this nitrous hotbox and start writing poetry. And there's actually artifacts of what they wrote. There's one that says Humphrey, and then in big letters, Newton. He thinks he's making all these discoveries and stuff. And he kind of was. I mean, this is the beginning of a glorious scientific career. It actually really helped him launch his name. So there's already this tradition of scientists having breakthroughs from nitrous, thanks to Humphrey Davy. What's different is that I mentioned that his friends were romantic poets. Even though Davy fancied that he was making both poetic and philosophical discoveries, nitrous got kind of coded as a thing that artsy, Baudelaire-adjacent 19th century poety people do, right? It's something you do to experience some kind of mystical state, which might help you write poetry about Kubla Khan and pleasure domes and reveries and all that sort of thing. William James is kind of emerging at a moment when nitrous changes, and it changes to be something very proto-psychedelic. I would actually say this is one of the foundational moments for what becomes the concept of the psychedelic. And it's actually thanks to this guy named Benjamin Blood, who I was looking at his papers this week. How many people here have heard of Benjamin Blood? Okay, good. You're a great room for this. I doubt many people, if I surveyed them elsewhere, would know. If you don't know him, his most famous concept is this idea of the anesthetic revelation. And the anesthetic revelation is, I would say, a very strongly proto-psychedelic concept that mixes together wisdom traditions. He's drawing a lot from ancient Greek and biblical traditions, but also something modern. So he describes himself in a letter to William James as inclined toward machines. And he is a kind of a tinkerer. He has a patent, he's like a technologist. He lives out in this small town, and he loves nitrous oxide and ether, and he publishes these little weird pamphlets that he sends to William James, and William James loves them. It's like this emerging bromance, a 19th century bromance around nitrous oxide that is actually very foundational to not just the formation of the concept of the psychedelic, but I would actually say modern science, because William James then extends some of these ideas into his Principles of Psychology, which is like one of the most foundational texts in the history of psychology, and to varieties of religious experience. So effectively, I would gloss the whole anesthetic revelation as ego death. Benjamin Blood is basically describing ego death, and he is so convinced that this feeling of being freed from the coil of identity, as he calls it, is so important that everyone who wants to be a philosopher or a scientist should experience it. And so that kind of messianic, we need to do something about society feeling is why I think this is different. You know, the Romantic poets going into the hotbox nitrous room, they did it to write poetry. They didn't think everyone who wants to understand the nature of consciousness should do that. It was like a fun thing. This is more like a tool, a technology of knowledge. By the way, I found this in the archive. This is Benjamin Blood's only surviving photo of himself. He claims it shows him lifting over 1,000 pounds with his right arm. I'm a little skeptical that that's 1,000 pounds, but this is his self-presentation. And then William James sees this and he's delighted. He pastes it in his family photo album and writes him back, "I confess that I did not expect the author of these works to look just like that." So he loves the photo. And I'm anxious to see the later editions of The Creature. I am so delighted to find that a metaphysician can be anything else than a strained, dyspeptic individual fit for no other use. Most of them have been invalids. And clearly he means most of us, because then he says, "I can't see, can't sleep, can't make a decision." Me neither, William. Feel the same way. Can't buy a horse, can't do anything that befits a man. So again, this is his neurasthenia, and he's seeing Benjamin Blood not just as this interesting interlocutor, but as almost like a savior figure, someone who can show him how to be a good kind of scientist. Look at this guy. He can lift 1,000 pounds, and he's constantly taking nitrous oxide and self-publishing pamphlets. He's amazing. So this is what I meant about the sort of neurasthenia that runs through the James family. So this is Alice James. And both Alice and William sort of self-diagnosed themselves. Actually, not self-diagnosed. In fact, the guy who coined the term neurasthenia diagnosed both of them with spinal neurasthenia. He was a friend of the family. So they're really embedded in this concept of neurasthenia, which is then very important in the later history of psychiatry, even though it falls out of use. So they're at the very top there. If you look, so spinal neurasthenia is at the very tippy top, right below sexual neurasthenia, which I've never even heard anyone talk about in public in Victorian texts. But it's like the highest, it's near the highest level of the bad neurasthenia. So how did they cure it? Well, that's where nitrous comes in. Alice and William both undergo various forms of therapy like baths, electroshock therapy, trying cannabis is one thing they both try. And this is electroshock therapy. I don't have time to talk about it here, but in Q&A, maybe we can talk more. And then nitrous. So this is amidst one of his neurasthenic breakdowns, he tries nitrous and discovers the secrets of Hegel and then is able to move beyond them. This is his actual publication of the bit I had read from you before. Just a small thing here. I just saw this in the archive. That weird stuff about what's mistake but a kind of take, what's nausea but a kind of ausea by George Nothing But O Thing. I always read that as just him doing wordplay. But actually, Benjamin Blood had this kind of proto-ethnographic theory about the foundational human language. Like early humans had this language where meaning was conveyed through sound. And if you actually, I was just doing this yesterday. This is the part I was like, oh, I actually found something new. This is a little pamphlet that Benjamin Blood published about this. And if you actually relate them, you can see he's saying, what's nausea but a kind of ausea? And A means vastness, space, place, or plane. And then here, nonsense actually becomes something with volume, solemnity, and nobility. So I'm almost certain that he's drawing directly on this little guide to how language shapes thought. And then he's probably muttering this out loud to himself while he's on nitrous and then writing it down, is my guess. Now, he's not the only person doing this. In the very same time period, his rival, the eugenicist James McKeon Cattell, who works with Francis Galton and kind of transplant eugenics principles of biometrics and sort of instrumentalizing science in the service of empire and race science. He's also experimenting with ether in this period. But the part I've bolded here is very telling. He describes it as kind of like electric shocks. He's not willing to go there into the mystical. He just says it feels really weird, feels like electric shocks. I seem to live a great deal in a short time, is the farthest he's willing to go there. And in public, when James writes about this in Principles of Psychology, he does say, he refers to his experiments and says, like, hashish produces strange perversions of the general sensibility. You seem enormously enlarged or strangely contracted. Or he actually says it's like your back is entirely absent, which is very relevant considering that he had debilitating back pain his entire life, which in his mind was deeply interwoven with his psychological problems. So he's kind of saying it made my spinal neurasthenia go away, hashish. But he doesn't actually go there. He does mention ether and chloroform produce not wholly dissimilar results. And I found a letter in the archive of him taking ether in this time period too. So he's definitely experimenting privately. What I would argue is that he's not fully going there with attributing these thoughts and findings to his drug experiences, however. He leaves that to the side and then later starts attributing them to psychical research. So I completely agree with Christian Greer yesterday that this is like a missing link in the history of psychedelics, partly because William James did not want to be known as that neurasthenic guy who was possibly, he may have been institutionalized himself as a young man. He definitely almost committed suicide in his 30s because he thought the mind is a machine, and it freaked him out so much. And he was very aware of his public perception of him. And so he kind of couches some of this very clearly anesthetic revelation-derived language in a discussion of psychical phenomena. And then later, in Varieties of Religious Experience, he does much the same in describing spiritual and religious experiences using terms that are virtually identical with how Benjamin Blood and James describe the experience of nitrous and ether. So I just flagged a few of the highlighted parts here that I think might feel familiar to people who have read a lot of psychedelic literature. You know, it baffles your habitual sense of teleology and moral meaning. This is kind of trippy. I mean, the infrahuman floating mind stuff, possessed of fragmentary gleams of superhuman cognition that gathers itself together by taking advantage of the trance states of some existing human organism. That's like almost Terence McKenna level out there, right? But he's attributing it to stuff that Leonora Piper, the spiritualist, is doing, even though it's very clear if you read his papers, he's also experiencing it as a person using these drugs. He doesn't continue using them. It's almost like psychical research displaces the earlier drug research. And this has been noted. I just want to flag that there's a really good book by Francesca Bordogna called William James at the Boundaries, which does make this linkage. But this is just like the one mention of Benjamin Blood. It's just like a sort of not a footnote, but it's just a mention in passing. I think there's really something interesting there. Good, perfect. So I have 5 minutes left. I'm wrapping up now, and I'm really looking forward to questions about any other things beyond just these two people. I'm kind of using them as emblematic figures, as metaphor, not even metaphors, but just like people to think with about these paradoxes. So Margaret Mead, as we saw, it got pretty dark in the LSD memo. And I went through periods when I was writing that book where I was like, is Margaret Mead secretly evil? Like, who is this person, you know? Experimentation on low-income groups. And what I came to the conclusion is that she was so enmeshed in the world of surveillance science, because it was, 1954, that it's like the fish doesn't know the water it's swimming in. And she was genuinely trying to do good, but she was just in a world coming out of World War II and the Korean War, where it was just so imbricated with what science was. Like over 90% of science in that period was funded by the Pentagon, and to this day, it still is a large percentage. So she was just kind of, a person of her time in that way. And William James, researching this book has been kind of refreshing because, like I said, he comes out very strongly against imperial science. He talks about how science is being used to brutalize the people of the Philippines and to destroy their spirits. And he's really kind of like a very ahead of his time thinker in that way, because he's saying this like in the year, the very beginning of the 20th century, like 1900. However, there's an interesting, I mentioned I'm trying to go back a little bit before the famous William James. 1870s William James was freaking out, partly because he couldn't understand Hegel, and partly because he thought that the mind is a machine, and he hated feeling like he was a machine. And he breaks free from that by saying, my first act of free will be to believe in free will. And this is kind of the beginning of pragmatism in the sense that you can kind of judge an idea based on what it actually does for you. It's about practical effects on the world. At the same time, he's still in touch with all those surveillance science people, with Galton and Spencer. He's actually friendly with them. And if you don't know Francis Galton, he's the person who coined the term eugenics and kind of made eugenics, even though it was not his sole invention. There was the Galton Institute, founded by his student Carl Pearson, which was probably the most influential mode for spreading eugenics around the world after his death. So he's a very foundational figure for eugenics and a whole wing of science around that, biometrics. And he was actually friendly with William James in the 1880s, and they strongly influenced each other at this key moment. So I'm going to end just by describing this moment, and let's just try to imagine. I'm not going to be able to evoke things as well as the last panel, which I thought was so evocative, but if we can just try to take a moment to imagine 1889 when the Eiffel Tower had just been built. So imagine living in a world where the tallest building in the world is the Eiffel Tower, and it's lit with electric light, which has just been invented. Like literally Thomas Edison is there in the fairgrounds below the Eiffel Tower showing people this new technology of electricity. And on the platform of the Eiffel Tower, that beautiful platform with its little Eye of Sauron searchlight roving around, kind of pinpointing random people in the crowd, is Francis Galton and William James, and they're getting drunk together. They're toasting each other with glasses of champagne. It's the end of the World Congress of Experimental Psychology, which was timed to coincide with the fair. And James and Galton actually collectively come up with the idea for 2 censuses or 2 surveys, these what they called circulars, but very much in common with 20th century modes of psychiatric research. They decide to send out, I'll just read it, a survey of questions relative to heredity and an international committee to take charge of it. And similar action was taken upon the census of hallucinations. So this is the Psychical Research, the Society for Psychical Research has this census of hallucinations, which is really important as like a foundational moment in understanding altered states of consciousness, the study of madness and study of mental illness, because a lot of the people they talked to were people who had been, slotted into the category of the insane. And it's like the exact place and time that Galton is sending out one of his first eugenics questionnaires. And in fact, James is publicly kind of celebrating that connection. So when we think about that moment, I think that's another, just like Margaret Mead sitting in her little turret in the Museum of Natural History in New York, thinking about whether she will take LSD and then comparing it to what she had just seen in her fieldwork off the coast of New Guinea. Here too, in 1889 in Paris, on this platform of the Eiffel Tower, is another one of those moments in formation of what becomes the modern concept of psychedelics. And it, just like Margaret Mead, is completely entangled between these 2 strands. And there's many other entanglements too, but these are the 2 that I've been kind of covering in this talk and in the book project, because I just find it fascinating how much they still continue to this day. So I'm just going to end by throwing out a few ideas here. Pluralism. When we talk about science being opposed to non-Western ways of knowing, what science are we talking about? If we're trying to break down binaries, we should not create one reified science, which is doing bad stuff, and which we contrast with indigenous ways of knowing. We clearly need to define science more clearly in these discussions. And I've attempted to do that here, even though I've jumbled them together, because it's impossible to fully disentangle them. I do think that there's parts of science emerging in the late 19th century which are much more amenable to being mobilized in discussions of contemporary psychedelic studies than others. Rather than just saying one science, which science? A pluralistic view of that, I think, is important. Likewise, what kind of psychedelic experience? Obviously, preaching to the choir. The point is, this is something people were starting to think about in the 1890s, not just in the 1970s or 80s, right? Or 60s. And I am guilty of making binaries. For instance, in Tripping on Utopia, I kind of make Timothy Leary into a villain, which I sort of regret. It's easy to do that when you're making a narrative. But when you're trying to disentangle narratives, which has been a theme of this conference, I think it's really interesting to see what happens when you pull that thread. We knot things together, we make them into a pretty picture. What happens if you pull it apart? How does it look if you kind of tease out those threads and see how things are entangled, but maybe not an obvious Manichaean binary or contrast between good and evil, or science and religion, or Western and non-Western, and so forth. And one thing to throw out there is just I've been interested in this conference and also in my discussions with psychedelic researchers, how much they have a personal, this is kind of getting back to Nicholas's point, a personal, very specific narrative that inspires them to do mass data collection, to do questionnaires, to do biometric research. It's always like something very specific, which is also entangled with something very big, something Francis Galton would have recognized that involves, statistics and having a very quantified approach to knowledge production. The other thing is I've been so struck by how entangled psychedelics and tech are, if we want to call it that. I think William James is the very beginning of when it makes sense to talk about tech. Like, for instance, he was doing a psychical research study at MIT in a letter I was reading a few days ago. And he said, well, isn't that apt? And I was like, what does he mean by that? Like, why is it apt to do psychical research at MIT? And I think he was just thinking at that point that there is something going on with technology and this proto-psychedelic milieu of people and substances and ideas. William James, it's worth mentioning, is, I would argue, the first person to describe a neural network. He actually uses that phrase, not exactly, but he says a network of neurons in the Principles of Psychology, and has this diagram, which really is the first diagram of a neural network. It's still, I've seen it like literally reproduced in machine learning textbooks today. So he's very much a beginning part of the story of AI research as well. And then finally, I think something, was it Sam who asked yesterday, or said yesterday, I don't want a future where everyone's tripping if we're super surveilled. I love that. It was so relevant to how I've been thinking about this. So I put it in the slides. What does it mean to be super surveilled? Margaret Mead is much like William James was both a patient and a practitioner. You know, he was himself someone suffering from forms of like altered mental states throughout his life that he found at times disabling and disquieting. And then he writes about them. And famously, he actually takes one of his own breakdowns, a moment that is deeply appalling to him in his life, and attributes it to a mental patient, a French mental patient, that he says, he kind of pushes it outside of himself and says, my friend sent me a report of a French mental patient who had this breakdown, and it was actually him. By the same token, Margaret Mead is doing TAT interrogations on a woman who's an MKUltra test subject, while herself being surveilled by the FBI, and in dire mortal, like not mortal, but extreme risk, because she's bisexual, and her life and career could have been destroyed in that moment. So it's never one thing. I know this is like a trite point, but it's really interesting how much who's surveilling who? What does that mean, you know? There's people in this room probably who do field work with people who are tripping. At various points, maybe they have thought that you are a spy or something who's watching, watching them. And it's an interesting thought about like the breakdown between the perceiver and the thing perceived in this context is interesting to think about. Final thing, I just want to say Rebecca Lamov and Paul and Anna Harrington and I have this grant from the Mahindra Center, thank you Mahindra Center, which is to kind of expand the psychedelic history archive, and both of these texts are on there. It's if you go to psychedelicarchive.com, the full text of both Margaret Mead's LSD memo and William James on nitrous oxide are there. So I just wanted to flag that. And I just want to end by saying, again, thank you to everyone who organized the conference. It's been an amazing experience. So thank you.